I'm extremely honored to be here today. I made this commitment almost a year ago, and I've been looking forward to it ever since then, in part because I have gotten to know several members of the Dayton section, and I think they're exceptional people, and I enjoy working with them, and I'm very flattered that they trusted me with this talk. I hope to take you through a little bit of a time trip in the next half hour. First through a journey that I took in the last 20 years, and then farther back to a story from World War II that I've learned only in small bits gradually over the years. I know that some of you are very familiar with this story, and some of you probably don't know anything about it, and may even be ready to question my credibility because everybody knows that the British were the ones who broke the Enigma code. I've faced just about every criticism over the last 20 years as I worked to uncover the story, but I am not a scientist, I am not a researcher. I did, and I enjoyed Dr. Camarda's talk very much because he spoke about several things that apply to me. I was the daughter of an electrical engineer who worked at National Cash Register, and even as a child, I knew that he was a very exacting and overachieving individual, and he instilled a love of math and science in me. To the extent that when I was in high school, I was determined to go into the sciences in college. And it was when I got into college in 1968 that I faced a series of challenges, not the least of which was that I was a girl. And unfortunately, at that point, I took a wrong turn and went into the liberal arts, disappointing my father, the electrical engineer, very, very much. But with those skills I gained in the liberal arts, a skill of using a library and researching and coming up with a hypothesis and trying to prove it, it became a real asset when I started researching this story. The story's about this man, my father, Joseph Dash, who was born in 1907 on the west side of Dayton, Ohio. And Dayton, Ohio is a little town just a little bit north of here if you follow I-75. But when he was born in Dayton, Ohio, and especially on the west side of Dayton, Ohio, he was born into a very unique and exceptional environment. He was surrounded by gigantic engineering projects at that time, and it had a heavy influence on his life. Now, I was born to my parents in 1950. I always tease Dr. Ewing because he says that I grew up watching history. Well, the history was mostly done by the time I was born. 20 years ago when I started talking, and I had a lot more blonde hair than white hair, people would stand up and say, "Mrs. Anderson, why didn't you ask more questions during the war?" And I'd go and act insulted, and I'd say, "I beg your pardon, I was born in 1950. It's not quite as funny now that I've got a lot of white hair and wrinkles, but I was an only child. My parents were married in 1935. But they remained childless till I was quite a surprise in 1950. My mom was 37 and my dad was 43. And I don't think that at that point in their lives they were quite prepared to have a baby. Here's a few pictures I've included from our family just to give you a flavor of my dad's personality. This is my favorite picture of all pictures. It's the most relaxed of all the photographs I have of my dad. he's the most relaxed. And Mom could almost never get him out of a white shirt and tie. He just, that was his uniform, and it's wonderful that he broke down and actually put on that shirt. He was an amateur photographer as a hobby, and I'll use some of his photographs. He never wrote a personal history, but he documented his life so well through his photographs and the papers that he left that it really helped me in uncovering the story. Dad was an excellent ballroom dancer. That's another odd thing about him. And when I say he was excellent, he and my mother, when they were young, would go dancing at the Biltmore Hotel in Dayton, and they would clear the floor, and people would step off the ballroom floor to watch Dad dance. Everything he did, he had to master. He had a very forceful personality, and that pose of him challenging the grill on a Sunday morning is typical. I said he lived in a white shirt and tie, and I meant it. This was a Saturday when he decided, I didn't know how to climb a tree. When I was a tomboy, but my parents were so worried. My health was kind of frail when I was young, and so when most of the kids learned to climb trees, I wasn't allowed to. So come the age of 10, I insisted one Saturday I learn how to climb a tree. So what did Dad do? He climbed up the tree for me and got up there and said, "See, this is how you do it." But he had his white shirt and tie on. I just say here, he was very formal. He went through ROTC in high school and college, and he entered the Army Reserve. He had a very erect posture. He was always very strong. But he rarely let his hair down, so to speak. And one time when my husband-to-be first stayed at our home overnight, Dad came out of his bedroom in his pajamas, and he had his pajama top buttoned all the way up to the neck. And my husband, Daryl, turned to me and said, "Your father is the only man I know who looks like he should be wearing a tie with his pajamas." Oops. We lived in a little, I shouldn't say little, it's a very nice house, but there's a 2-bedroom house in Oakwood, a suburb of Dayton. Dad had the house built in 1940, just before the war. And you can see the English influence in the architecture. With the 2 bedrooms, my parents had the master bedroom, and when I was born, I slept in the spare bedroom. And this is one of the very few pictures I have of the spare bedroom. I'm in there with both my grandmothers. But if you'll notice something about that, that's my bedroom, but there's heavy oak furniture in it. And it wasn't until I was much older, we moved from that house when I was 7, but when I was much older, I thought, it's really odd that there's such formal furniture in what became the child's bedroom. There was a heavy oak desk and those oak shelves, and the desk was unusual in that my parents apparently had not cleaned it out, and there were things like atlases and map pins, drafting tools, and even a pinup calendar, which I discovered, and which Mom quickly took away. Dad always referred, even when I was a child, I remember him calling that Meter's bedroom. And later I would learn and realize that that's where Commander Meter slept during the war. So this is my dad in the 1970s. My mother died in 1971, just 2 months after I graduated from college. And I was very much in love with my husband-to-be, but we went to graduate school at Ohio State in early 1972. But it was at that time, beginning on our weekends back in Dayton, that Dad and I would be left alone to talk. He had always used my mother as a confidant, and many of the stories that I heard, I would overhear at night when they were talking. But without my mother, he had no close person to talk to. So during this time, he began sharing his stories of his life with me. He always sat in that green chair. I photoshopped this photo years ago because there was a martini in his hand. And you'll notice that there's, and I don't know why I bothered, because I always tell people that I photoshopped the martini out of his hand. But anyway, that posture and that smile on his face is what I associate with everything he did tell me. So my father died then in 1987 at the age of 80. I was 37, and he left a house full of documents, some of which I'm still finding. Just to tell you, after a year, we decided to move into his house, which is good, because if we had tried to clean his house out for sale, we might have thrown away a lot of things, a lot of historical treasures that are now very important. But to return to the search, Dad left stacks of documents on the dining room table that he used in the basement. And it was by looking through these documents that I realized that some of the stories he had told me about the war had much greater significance than I realized. The first one is this photocopy, which he had been sent by Bob Mumaw, who was a friend. It is a copy of an article in the Navy Times from 1984. And in the document, it mentions that there had been some waves, women in the Navy during World War II who had been assigned to Dayton, Ohio. And if you'll notice, there's a picture of a machine which it identifies as a machine built at the National Cash Register Company. I read that and was confused and decided it was far easier for me to just think, well, that's not what Dad was talking about. My father wasn't associated with it, so I'm going to forget it. Then in 1990, in the Dayton Daily News, one day there was an announcement that some NCR equipment was going to be displayed at the Smithsonian Institution. And in that article was a mention again of top secret code breaking equipment that had been built at NCR. And I believe even in there, my father's name was mentioned. Now at that point, that had absolutely no significance to me. And the fact that nobody had called me up to tell me it was going on hurt even more. And just to clear up, the book about the Enigma, written by Winterbottom, a British codebreaker, had been out since 1973. So stories about the Enigma and code breaking were out in the society, but they had no relevance to me and my family that I knew of. But to return to the Smithsonian, I was very, very curious at this point and wondering what connection my dad had to the story, if any. So I, being a dash, I just picked up the phone and called the Smithsonian because we don't beat around the bush when we want to find something out. But I called down to the Smithsonian, to the, I believe the Museum of American History had just opened, and I managed to speak to the curator of the exhibit that they had put together. And that exhibit is a classic at this point. The whole concept of the Age of Information was a brand new concept. And if you want to look it up, it's now written up online. But anyway, my husband and I went down, and there, for the first time, I saw this machine in person. And it's a monster. It's 7 feet tall and 10 feet long and 2 feet deep, and I believe it weighs 2,000 pounds. No, I believe it's more than that. But anyway, that machine was there. It was the high point of the Age of Information exhibit, and it said it was labeled as being built in Dayton, Ohio, but the only other signage associated with it was a tribute to Alan Turing. Oh. It was also during that trip that I first visited Fort Meade, Maryland. The curator of the exhibit had put me in touch with a gentleman who was a historian for the National Security Agency. And she had given me his phone number, which is not something you're supposed to do. So I called the number, and a gentleman, a very, very nice person in the history section of the NSA, answered the phone, and I said, hi, and I said, my name's Debbie Anderson, I'm in Dayton, Ohio, and I think I have some questions for you. And the first words out of his mouth were, how did you get this phone number? So at that point, the Center for Cryptologic History was in a Quonset hut at the back of the headquarters building. So after we left the Smithsonian, my husband and my sons and I got in our minivan and drove to Fort Meade, and without any caution or worry, we just drove right down the driveway into the compound, and we were quickly stopped. Anyway, that was the first time I went through a security check. My sons were very young. I think they were in 6th grade and 4th grade. And this was a real fun thing for them. And they started to open the door of the minivan and get out. And these 2 guards with guns stepped forward and said, stop, get back in that car. You 3 can't go. You have to leave. So I'm standing there with a shopping bag full of documents, and I watch my husband and sons pull away and leave me there at the guard station. But anyway, I spent a day there. I met wonderful people in cryptologic history, and I left with more questions than answers, of course. And I only recently found out that one reason I did leave with more questions than answers was that, as far as the Center for Cryptologic History was concerned, this story had been lost. It had been so heavily guarded over the years, and we're approaching 50 years at that point, that the younger historians literally did not know what I was talking about when I said, I believe a man in Dayton, Ohio has an association with not only the building, but the design of this machine. And just to mention, this is a little disjointed, but I would be very remiss if I did not mention the veterans of this project. What I was uncovering was that this story that my dad was involved in had been classified ultra secret for 50 years, and that included the Navy veterans of the project. The men and women who I ultimately met at their first reunion when they were discharged from the service had any mention of their being stationed in Dayton stricken from their record. It was very dramatic when we started piecing this story together. It also made it impossible for these veterans to be able to stay in touch with each other. They literally lost track of each other over the years unless they were the very best of friends and maintained correspondence. But we were able finally to have their very first reunion in 1995 in Dayton, Ohio, and that was a thrill. I I have the highest respect for everyone associated with the project. So now, very quickly, this story begins in Dayton. My dad was born, as I said, on the west side. He was born into a family of blacksmiths. He was born into a very hard-working family. His mother was a German immigrant, but his father's family, the Deshes, had been in the United States since 1830s. It was a very unique time in Dayton history in that from where my father lived, and he would walk to school by crossing bridges over the Miami River, he was surrounded by incredible feats of engineering. The Great Miami River had had a massive flood in 1913, and some of the leading civic fathers had gotten together and come up with a conservancy project to prevent that flooding from ever happening again. And cutting-edge theories of civil engineering were being exercised in the building of a dam system, and the channel of the river was actually moved. My father would literally, wherever he went, he had to cross a bridge to get over the river. He would have witnessed that. Then once over the river, he would have walked through the National Cash Register Company, which even at that point was an international company supplying cash registers around the world. And then in another direction, he would see the pilots of McCook Field, men who had returned home from World War I and were trying out new planes and new equipment along the riverbank in downtown Dayton. His home, where he was born, is less than a mile from the Wright brothers' home, and also very close to their airplane factory. So, my gosh, what a time to be a young man in Dayton. Now, the flip side of this is that my dad learned to take care of himself. He was a very determined individual, and even though he was somewhat sheltered, he grew up in a rough part of Dayton, Ohio, and in the floodplain. And he used to talk about learning to play dice or shoot dice and box. As he called it, the manly art of fisticuffs. And he had a group of friends he hung out with. Now, Dad loved these stories about the railroad tracks and the characters he would meet and the things that he would get into. When I started working down at the NCR archive to research this story, this photograph was on the lobby wall. And the first day I walked in, I just said, well, that's my father up there. And at that point, they really did think I was delusional because I had very little proof of anything I was claiming. But anyway, it came out during the research that just happened to be an NCR photographer was going around shooting photographs of activities for young men, and NCR was building playgrounds. And this was the before picture. Then there's an after picture of the same group of young men playing baseball. But that's my dad there with that little cap on and the white hair, that gentleman there. So he learned how to take care of himself and defend himself. Now I'm going to jump ahead here because of time constraints. He did get a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering from the University of Dayton in 1929, but then immediately after graduation, the Depression hit. And so for more or less for 6 years, he freelanced. He was associated with a place called Dayfan Radio, which then became General Motors Radio. And luckily through that association, he met Charles Kettering. And that was one of the turning points in his life when Charles Kettering found out what a bright young man. Dad had fallen in love with radio when he was very young. I believe he said about the age of 11. And as you know, radio was almost non-existent when he would have been 11 in 1918. Commercial stations were just getting on the air. But that influence, this was a tough one for me to figure out, but I believe the influence of McCook Field and witnessing the pilots talking to the ground stations probably exposed him to the wonders of wireless radio. So one of the freelance jobs he did was he built radio receivers and transmitters for people, and that looks like a nice one. That's the opinion of a liberal arts student. But down in the papers he left, I found some very early designs that he did for radio. And this is for his receiver. He was W8ANP, but he designed a teletype for Charles Kettering. That's a close-up. He always did the sexy shots of his equipment, and this is his close-ups of his teletype. That teletype was very pivotal in getting him into engineering circles in Dayton. So eventually he was hired through a series of steps. In 1938, he was hired at the National Cash Register by Colonel Edward Deeds, who was president at that point, to begin an electrical research laboratory. You'll see research and future development there. Electrical engineering at NCR before that point meant electrifying the cash register and electrifying accounting machines. But Dad was hired to do research, and this is when Dr. Camarda's talk becomes very, very relevant to what I can find in the records happening at NCR. Colonel Deeds, who was a member of a national group of scientists and was very aware of scientific research, literally gave Dad a green light to research whatever he thought was most important in whatever way he thought was best. And boy, you talk about a wonderful situation for a young guy who's very confident of his opinions. So this is one of his lab books, which I found at the NCR archive, and some of his early designs. And you'll see right there, up in the top paragraph, he's already working on calculating machines. He hired a few really good engineers. It was a very small team, and immediately they started turning out. This was a calculating machine that he applied for the patent, I believe in 1940 or 41. In 1942, I found in our basement at home a carbon copy of a research report that he submitted, and you'll notice that he documents the history of his thoughts, where he was going from just a very simple calculator that would go up to 10 to the third power to where he's thinking about division and faster counters. Of course, concurrent with this, we have the world situation where the National Defense Research Council, which Colonel Deeds was a member of, or the predecessor, the Office of Scientific Research and Development, were starting to look for cutting-edge ideas for defense equipment. So now we get to a real sexy shot here. That is the way that Dad implemented his plans for a fast counting machine. He developed a tube. He had been using thyrotrons in that calculator, but they were big. I think they were 885s. They were big, off-the-shelf thyrotrons, and he wanted it better and better and more accurate impulse, so he developed his own tube, and he put them in these counting banks. And for instance, you'll see those tubes in the code-breaking machine. But he started getting defense contracts, and that put an end to research for the sake of pure research, but it accelerated the rate of their development. He eventually got a team of about 15 engineers at NCR, all of whom were radio amateurs, and they they started developing faster and faster counting banks. This particular counting bank was given in contract to the University of Chicago. Dad later told me that he delivered it in person to the lab at the University of Chicago. He knew it was high priority and secret, but he didn't know what it was for. But he told me that he knew something was up right away when he got off the train and arrived at the lab, and it was surrounded by armed Marines. And Edward Teller came out in person and took the counter from him. There it is. That's what he delivered. But anyway, he got up to 1 million counts per second with that counter, which was incredible for that time. And it was quite an achievement. And that achievement got him the attention of ultimately the U.S. Navy. Now, the complicating factor, of course, is the Battle of the Atlantic. And I believe you probably all have a better firm grasp of military history than I do. But the Battle of the Atlantic is the theater which this equipment is eventually going to be used. As you know, I'm sure that 1942 was a critical year of losses for our merchant ships going to supply England. There's a map I found at the Mariners Museum of the losses. Each mark on that map is three boats lost. So against the backdrop of the Battle of the Atlantic, the U.S. Navy was getting frantic because of the losses they were suffering, and that was in part due to the excellence of the German communication machine with the U-boat fleet. Now, I put this in for fun. I had this section in a talk I gave for Dr. Ewing last year, and I waded into the deep water of the mathematics of the Enigma machine. This display here is from the National, I realize you guys can't see over there, can you? The National Security Agency Museum in Fort Meade. The Admiral Dennett insisted on complete control of his U-boat fleet at all times. And of course, the U-boats need to rely on radio for communications with their headquarters. So their communications of necessity, since Dennett insisted on constant ability to contact them, had to be hidden in the best security possible. Now, the Enigma machine, which is that typewriter-like machine in the picture there, had been around Europe since 1921. Several people had developed a commercial encrypting machine for financial transactions back then. The best known is a fellow named Scherbius who patented a machine and called it an Enigma. And it started out as a much simpler machine that would rely on scrambling by the rotation of wheels imprinted without the alphabet. Over the years, it got more and more complex, and the powers of possibilities increased. Now, there's the basic design of the machine. The input is a letter, and the ultimate output is a light on the deck there. But once you type the letter in, it goes through a series of scramblings and little bells and whistles that were added to make it more and more complex. So there's actually, if I can do this from memory, there's actually 5 variables in an Enigma machine. It's the setting on the plug board down there, which was added during the war, I believe. There's an initial position there. You'd have a choice of metal rotors, and you could pick which ones the command would tell you which ones to pick. And that was a certain number of variables. Where you set it, they had notches along the rim. Where you set it on those notches was a variable. Let's see now. I'm not going to. Oh, and the key setting up at the top, you notice the key was assigned. But anyway, there's the plug board. Now, I'll just allude to this. This is fun. It really is. There's enough of the math student left in me that I love doing this. If you first calculate all the possible potential variables out of this setting, you get various figures. This is the equation for the variables in the plug board by itself. Variables in the rotors. As I said, there's 3 different variables in the rotors, and I won't read all this. You can find all this online. There's an excellent book put out by the NSA on this. But there's the math for all the rotor possibilities. Whoops. And of course, then you multiply all those. And with 3 rotors, I believe you get 10 to the 81st. No, I forget. But with 4 rotors, you get 10 to the 141st power. Now, we had to mention the fun with the math of the Enigma. And there are cryptographers who take this very seriously. When we had a reunion in 2001, which was our second and last reunion of the veterans, we had several people there who had done their own calculations on the Enigma. And there are so many variables between whether there are 3 rotors or 5 or 8, or how many plugs go in the plug board. And of course, the actual use in the field is much different than the potential use of the machine. But we had Tony Sale from England there, and we had a noted author, Colin Burke, at the reunion, and we had a representative from the NSA. And they each had a different number of possible combinations for the Enigma, and it got pretty heated. So that's the fun with the Enigma of the math. There's a lot of fun things about this subject. Well, anyway, what happened in Dayton because of the Battle of the Atlantic? When the U.S. Navy chose NCR to build a code-breaking machine. Now, there was a great deal of lead up to this and diplomatic tensions between America and England, and I won't go into any of that. It's all very well covered in there's a wealth of material out now about this subject, but there's very little about Dayton. One of the documents I uncovered, or I found in the National Archives, was the order from President Roosevelt granting the project in Dayton the AAA preference, and it also had AAA security classification for a Navy contract NXS 7892. There were only 2 other projects during the war that had this priority: the Manhattan Project and the Proximity Fuse Project. And now that I've said that, I believe the Radar Project had it too. But anyway, Dayton was not an Eastern Coast research center. It was a manufacturing plant in Dayton, Ohio, which made it unique. Here, in a document from the archives, is a very brief history of the lead up to why they picked Dayton, Ohio. And this document's on my website. Most of these documents are on my website. But it's arguing the necessity in the second paragraph, you'll see the necessity for a special analytical machine. So once the money started flowing to this project in Dayton, Ohio, the Navy actually took over my father's lab, and he was no longer reporting to the president of NCR. He was reporting to Op 20G in the Navy. And this, if you recognize, is the front porch of our home in Dayton, Ohio. Is an interesting story about this. My dad would never tell me exactly what was going on during the war, but he did, one of his favorite stories was that the house they lived in a very nice, normal residential area, was under 24-hour guard during the war. There was a lot of security surrounding my father, both to protect him and also because he had, his mother was a German immigrant and he had relatives still in Germany, and he also had a 3,000-watt transmitter in his basement. And he spoke German. It took me a while to figure that one out, but I think that had something to do with it. This is a scene from during the war. Because Dad's house was already secure and under guard, and it was a nice house, they decided to make it a place for brass for important people to stay during the war. And my dad speaks about this in an interview with the Smithsonian, which is also on my website. But I'll just quickly point out, took me a long time to identify these people. This is Admiral Joseph Redman, who was the, I believe is the head of Op 20G during the war. This gentleman is Commander Edward Travis, who was the head of Bletchley Park in England. This is Ensign Osborne, I believe she was in charge of the waves. The gentleman peering over Travis's shoulder is a gentleman, Commander Meter, I think he was then Captain Meter, who actually lived with my parents. And these three gentlemen are emergency commissions from MIT. They came down to assist on the project. And I believe one of them is John Howard, who is very well known in computer development later in the war. Eventually, this project became almost a who's who of future computer development. But anyway, again, there were only 2 bedrooms, and Meter claimed one, and my parents had the other. So people were sleeping on the floor. Mom said some of them slept up in the attic. I really feel for my mother. And it would have been very important to her to make sure everybody was well taken care of and well fed and left with a good impression. She must have been exhausted. Anyway, they took over a building at NCR which had been built as a night school. It was a nearly new building. It stood off by itself and it was easily guarded. It was also air conditioned. And that's where they worked. It was also near railroad tracks. There were a number of advantages to this building. And I don't mean to give the story short shrift, but I'm going to jump ahead. This is the machine that they eventually came out with to assist in the analysis of Enigma communications. And I've grown very fond of this machine. Every time I visit it, it's like a pilgrimage. It's similar in part to the British machine in that they have rows. Each one of these rows is an equivalent to an Enigma. And the machine, there's 8 in front and 8 in back. I think I have a picture of the back here in a minute. And those things would speed, those rotors would spin at 1,750 RPM. And they could be deadly if they flew off the spoke. Dad said at one point when they were testing the machine, one literally did fly off the spoke, went up, went straight through the ceiling and out the roof. They were pretty powerful. There's some obvious things. This is the powertrain, and also the brake is down here. And there's a switch. They could switch from 4 to 3 rotor Enigma if they needed to. There's a printer. Dad added a printer to it. But the real gem in this machine is Dad's electronic chassis up at top. This was groundbreaking technology for the time, and it took me a long time before I understood how significant those chassis were. One of them is actually a memory, because the rotors were spinning so fast, and the wave would put in several likely settings for the Enigma based on cribs and other cryptographic tricks. So she would put in the likely settings, and then they'd run the machine, and when a circuit was completed and they made a hit, the machine would break. Well, they're spinning at 1750, well, the fast row couldn't stop immediately. So Dad came up with a way in those Cytron banks up at top that it would memorize where the hit was and back up to that setting. And that's only one of the little gems he has up there. And again, if you want to read more about those those chassis, there's a document on my website. There's the back. You'll know, I think there's several miles of cable with this machine. It's fascinating to stand and study it. They also had to do a whole series of variations on the machine because the Germans were constantly playing with tricks on the Enigma. They'd hook two Enigmas together and double encrypt something, or they'd try different things. So there's a whole garden variety of bomb add-ons to adapt to all these different settings from the Germans. And a lot of them are called grenades. And it took me a long time to figure out grenade was nickname for little bomb. So anyway, the machines were manufactured in Dayton and shipped to Dayton, or to a building in Washington, D.C., which is now on Nebraska Avenue. They were set up there. That NCR built 120 of them. Then there's more about that online too. That building, which was called the Naval Communications Annex, or just Nebraska Avenue, then went to Naval Intelligence, to the Naval Security Group Command, and now it's the home of the Department of Homeland Defense, which is kind of cool. The Navy didn't want to give it up, but the fact that it's still in use for security is pretty neat. I'll stop here a sec. Does anybody want to ask a question? Yes, sir. The only one that is known of is at the NSA Museum in Fort Meade. And that's where that one, well, no, I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of it there, but that's where it is. Yes, National Cryptologic Museum. It's right next to the mothership. When we visit, you know, there's NSA headquarters and there's a little museum, so anyway. That's a Fort Meade joke. Now, the end of the war. I'm just hitting the highlights here, and I'm not doing a lot of subjects justice, including one is Dad suffered a nervous breakdown in the fall of 1944, and he really was not in direct command of the project after that point. But in 1947, he did receive the Presidential Medal for Merit. This citation was hanging in our home all the while I was growing up. But when something is there every day and you become familiar with it, you no longer see it. This is the citation that accredited him with the design of a very crucial machine. Now, how did I know that he was the actual research director and designer of the machine? That was a really tough thing to figure out, and it's probably the last big discovery I made or last big story I learned. But I'll just tell you this briefly because I'm very proud of it. Very, very early on, 1989, when I was trying to figure out what Dad's story meant, I called out to the Truman Museum, or in Independence, Missouri, the Truman Library, because Dad's citation was signed by Harry Truman. And the historian there said, well, I really can't help you because those sort of things are in the National Archives, but I'll give you advice. If I were you, I'd look up the nomination for his award of the medal. Well, that years passed. And in 2004, I found myself at the National Archives, and I decided to finally look up that nomination. And that the nomination was in some papers from the Department of State. My husband took that while I stayed down in the military history section, and he went up and asked for the nomination for Joseph Desch for the Medal for Merit. The archivist went back and came out and said, I'm sorry, that's still classified. And Daryl said, I don't understand why it would be, it's 1947. Well, the box containing the nomination for Dad's medal literally had not been declassified. So the archivist said, give us overnight, I'll get it cleared, and tomorrow we'll open it. So Daryl went back the next morning, and sure enough, it had been cleared, and they broke open the seal on a box of papers, and it was a batch of nominations. In that batch was a nomination for Bob Hope for a Medal for Merit, and for Irving Berlin for a Medal for Merit. So when Daryl finally brought the box to me, I got to see those too. But we finally got to see the nomination, which was written by Admiral DeWitt Clinton Ramsey, naval commander during the war. And it's a beautiful nomination, but it's also online on my website. But one of the two sections, the first one is where the language for his citation signed by Truman came through, saying that many of these successes rest upon the technical achievements in basic research and development, which were the result of Mr. Desch. But the second page was a complete eye-opener, because nobody during my search from 1990 to 2005 had ever sat down and outlined to me exactly what the results were of the development of the cryptanalytic bomb. And you notice up there, and again, this goes back to Dr. Camarda's talk, that team that Dad had literally had to turn on a dime and do everything they could to make a machine work. I had heard some rumors of this, but it says his exceptional brilliance in the design of a particular type of analytic machine was responsible for the successful operation and a major role in the Battle of the Atlantic, the Mediterranean campaign, and the Normandy landing. In addition to carrying out the design of the equipment, which was based on tolerances of almost unachievable exactness, Mr. Desch was forced to design and develop special vacuum tubes and to carry out investigations in the chemical composition of electrical components, as well as to develop special plastic materials in which to embed these components. The complexity of this equipment is indicated by the fact that one unit contains several thousand tubes and relays and over 1 million soldered connections. I have always been left with the impression that this team that was put together for these 3 years in Dayton, Ohio, ranks among one of those special think tanks where an odd group of engineers from Dayton, most of whom were radio amateurs, and a group of brilliant scientists from MIT got together and came up with ingenious solutions to problems that had never been faced before. So now to the more mundane, back to radio, which is always in Dad's mind. He was home because of the nervous breakdown for quite a while, and he decided to build himself the radio tower, to build indoor radio towers. As I said, when Joe Dash did something, he didn't do it halfway. It's one of the great things. He also began a lab at NCR, took up where he left off in 1942, and designed his own tube lab, which was everything that he had wanted to do with tubes before the war. Instead of hot discharge tubes, he was going to cold discharge. He experimented with a lot of different inert gases. He really thought that little neon tubes were the wave of the future. And of course, then I came along. Now, in 1973, Dad gave an interview for the Smithsonian, and a lot of what I mentioned here is contained in that interview. This is just a picture of the guy that I got to know really well in the 1980s with one of my sons. Last year, it was a big thrill. The National Security Agency inducted Dad into their Hall of Honor. He is the first non-agency, non-military person to be inducted into their Hall of Honor, and it was really cool. I was happy. There's been a book written about this that came out in 2004, I believe, The Secret in Building 26. You can still, it's available online. I helped produce a movie called Dayton Codebreakers, which is broadcasting on American public television and will be through 2014. And then, back to the fun part. If you want to take home an idea for your leisure time, build your own Enigma machine. There has been an explosion of interest in this cryptography online. When I look back from where I started in 2002, I started looking online for help. And when I looked yesterday, I could not believe there are constantly new things coming on board. This is a gentleman we hauled out for a talk. Looks like he had too much Red Bull. But there are all sorts of fun websites like this. People playing with cryptography, having fun. Yeah, a dad who took his child's machine and turned it into an Enigma. You gotta admire it. I saw online somebody has written a website how you can take an Intel chip and turn it into a cryptanalytic machine. But why not? So it's just a few, that particular thing there is on YouTube. And there's my website, DaytonCodebreakers.org. I try to have fun with it, but I also try to keep it serious. So if you want to contact me or learn more about it, I'd be flattered if you'd go there. And thank you.